The idea that there have been ages where women once ruled is not new. Archaeologists have found evidence pointing to several examples of societies that were matriarchal, and yet, for many mainstream historians, this concept is still unsettling. In a 2017 study, a team of scientists led by archaeologist Douglas Kennett of Pennsylvania State University found evidence of a matrilineal society in New Mexico's Chaco Canyon. The remains of 14 women were discovered beneath a dazzling cache of more than 15,000 turquoise necklaces and pieces of shell jewelry. The remnants of these women were found in an elite series of burial chambers that marked them as among the most noble members of Chacoan society. And astoundingly, under closer examination, it was revealed that no fewer than 9 of the individuals shared the exact same matrilineal DNA, which is passed only from mother to child, concluding that power and influence was passed down through the female line. Archaeologists are now finding that there have been many ancient cultures that once worshipped female deities.
There clearly was a time in remote antiquity when the feminine, the female, was regarded as the single most important aspect of humanity. And you have, going back at least 30,000 years, deep into the Upper Paleolithic, you have these, they're referred to as goddess figures. These are large-breasted, large-hipped female figures. They're the dominant iconography of that period, and that iconography continues all the way down through the Upper Paleolithic and into the Neolithic. There was a time when our ancestors venerated the goddess, not the male god.
In places like Central Asia and Siberia, where the female shaman, or shamaness if you wish, was one of the great power sources. And obviously the different saints and holy women of places like China and India, and within other societies like North tradition, where you know, the very fierce shield maidens and things like this that would go out in battle and be more powerful than the many men. But probably the last vestige of this female role came down to us through Greek tradition as the Amazon. These incredible warriors, this warrior caste that supposedly only contained females. The Amazons weren't a single tribe though. They seemed to be a buzzword for a number of different female societies that survived in various parts of the ancient world. For instance, there were Amazons in the Sahara. There's lots of stories to do with their great deeds there. There were Amazons in the area of the Caucasus, what today is Georgia and of the Russian steppes. There were others in the Urals and the Altai mountains. So they weren't necessarily all one tribe, but what they seemed to represent was the last vestige of this female caste that were the rulers, if you like, of their domain, of their world. And it was something that they did without the necessity of men other than for reproduction purposes. And I think that the key to understanding this is that the role of the female in the past was much, much more powerful, much more stronger than we give it credit for. And it could well be that when we look at the builders of Göbekli Tepe or the Anunnaki, or those who built Stonehenge, were mainly female priesthoods. And it's difficult to even conceive of it in a way, but it is strongly possible, so we should never rule it out. And we should always be genderless as far as those ancestors who gave us this legacy of the ancient wisdom.
Could it be possible that references in ancient text allude to a mother goddess before the first civilization?
des éléments qu'on retrouve dans...
When we take a look at the first chapters from the book of Genesis about the creation, the garden, etc., many events are not in the biblical texts. Sumerian texts give incredible additional information, whether it is in Gnostic ones or in the Enuma Elish, which is the Babylon text about the creation. What's interesting is that they all mention a mother goddess that comes from the depths. Sophia is the mother of the abyss because, as the story goes, she went to the deepest point of the abyss in order to create the world as we know it. In Gnostic, Sumerian, even Egyptian texts, the abyss is always linked to the process of creation. All mother goddesses were.
Sophia really comes from a Greek term, sophis, which means wisdom. In the beginning, before there was even a god or a creative force, everything was dark, nothing existed. And because God and wisdom and knowledge are simultaneous with each other, they figured, well, if that's the case, then wisdom must have existed in the dark. And in order for it to be procreative, it had to be feminine. So they created this concept of a divine feminine person, a woman, who embodied the whole perfection of the wisdom and all the sum knowledge of everything that exists in the universe. So the Greeks show up and they called her Sophia, based on Sophis, the term for wisdom.
If wisdom emerged from the darkness and its procreative nature was feminine by some early accounts, then why at some point was it forgotten or switched? In the biblical stories of the Garden of Eden, Yahweh, or God, forbids the humans in the garden to partake from the forbidden tree of knowledge. When a serpent seduces Eve to eat an apple from this tree, it leads to mankind's expulsion from the garden and thereby from eternal life. But according to Anton Parks, the Sumerian texts interpret this story differently. They suggest that the serpent approaches the woman as if she is the teacher.
De Yahvé, telle qu'on peut la trouver dans la Genèse.
In the book of Genesis, we know that before patriarchy came about, there was a matriarchy. When these gods arrive on Earth and settle in Eden on Karsuk Mountain, they were all under a matriarchal system, and Ninmah was their queen. The very interesting tablets of Eden express that. The woman is collecting fruits for the colony, and we understand that the man was doing more manual work. The text states that the secret was given by the serpent. The serpent tells the woman, and then she goes to tell the man. The so-called secret that the serpent is going to tell the woman, found in Sumerian tablets, is the secret of tool making. Quite simply, the tool, which is expressed as niche in Sumerian, means tree and tool. One could wonder why Enki insists on getting this particular secret through to the humans. Well, he has a desire to set them free. It is very clear, you can see it well. He wants to liberate them. I think that he didn't enjoy watching slaves working in the fields, serving in Lille. The woman's intelligence is often mentioned in Gnostic texts about the garden. The woman is generally wise, intelligent. She is enlightened from motherhood, from the origins, and has the intelligence and the wisdom of the serpent. If we read the original Sumerian texts, the woman only passes on the information that was given to her by the serpent. This civilizing tool for mankind is to become self-sufficient and free itself from slavery. What's more, in Sumerian tablets of Eden, when the woman messenger is mentioned, she is very often called the wise woman.
If there was a wise woman, where did she disappear to? Researchers like Freddie Silva have discovered that other stories that empower women in ancient evolution have been omitted from the Bible.
One of the greatest examples of the shift from matriarchal to patriarchal society really revolves around the story of Jesus, believe it or not. It's a huge misconstruct, and we know this because two of the most important pieces of evidence, which were the Gospels of Philip and Thomas, were banned by the church until they were inconveniently found by two goat herders in the desert at Nag Hammadi. And the idea was that when you joined a secret mysticism school, you joined as a son of a woman. When you graduated from that, you went up to another level of understanding. You graduated as a son of a man. If you got to the next stage, you became son of the gods, and then, and this is the most interesting part, when you actually went into the final initiation process, and initiation means to become conscious, that's what the word means. You undertook a out-of-body experience. It was an induced near-death experience where you took a narcotic, almost like a poison, which lowers your heartbeat down to a point where you are virtually comatose. Back in those days, those sects held that the women had the highest level of initiation. They actually were responsible for the initiate while he or she undertook this out-of-body experience. They were called the bees, or the watchtower, the flock, which is actually Mary Magdalene's name, Magdal Eder, the watchtower of the flock. Your soul leaves the body anywhere between 3 to 7 days, and you come back into your body, a little bit groggy, and you are taken out by the priestesses onto a mound, and the first thing you see is the rising of Venus, the morning star, at the spring equinox. That's why Jesus compares himself to the morning star. So did Osiris in Egypt, who was also a disembodied man who gets chopped up by 72 people. Of course, he reconstitutes himself, which is the symbol of the resurrected inner human being. The shift from matriarchal to patriarchal really happens around the time when the Catholic Church is beginning to find its roots, when fundamental Christianity splits from Gnostic Christianity, and the fundamentalists were killing all the Gnostic Christians.
Could it really be true that details about the ages of matriarchal rule were censored from some ancient text? Freddie Silva has discovered a similar text to the Gnostic story about Mary Magdalene that is written in the Quran.
Two most important people, John the Baptist and Mary Magdalene, are basically given very minor roles in the Bible. And now we know why. Because we have the patriarchal system that takes away the concept of the matriarchal being the most important part of initiation, and then they went off and killed everybody around the Middle East that could say otherwise. That's the one thing that all the sects have in common, including early Islam, by the way, that says exactly the same thing, that the actual crucifixion didn't really take place, and the person that actually was crucified in the real event was actually not Jesus. It was a guy called Simon of Cyrene. This is the Quran saying this. So the church annihilates everybody else that was saying the complete opposite, and that's why we now have a patriarchal system instead of a matriarchal system. So that's how easily this concept gets taken apart.
I think in the past, female cultures have been given a bad press. We know about kingship, we know about great battles fought by men, and we know that whole civilization seems to be focused around patriarchal societies. But clearly that was not the case in prehistoric times. It would seem as if the female had a much stronger role in society, and may even have been the controlling influences governing the places of power, which would have been seen as the axis mundi, that the axis of the earth, possibly even having a seat of power, the origin of what we would call the throne today. So in many ways they were the first kings. They were the embodiment of life itself. From them all life came, of course, as it's only women that can bear children. And this was understood by men, recognised and honoured by men who had a different role in life. I mean, as to exactly what that was, we don't want to stereotype any of these images, but something changed over time.
If this is indeed true, what has changed since the early ages where a matriarchal society governed our planet peacefully? Anton Parks believes that the rise of patriarchy began when humans decided to go out on their own and start building cities. According to his research, the Sumerian texts show us how the war between Enki and Enlil is reflected in the origin of the struggle for power between men and women.
If you try to distinguish between the two energies that drive matriarchy and patriarchy, we can find it in all the texts that speak of this. It is constantly the fight between Mars and Venus, war and peace, finding a balance between the two. With my research on Sumerian Eden, I found a historical event. We are not speaking about legends here, but of the history of Sumer. It is about the two cities who are fighting each other. Both of them were part of the realm of Uma. The two towns were situated in front of the realm of Serbula, which means the bird of eternal youths. The Serbula realm is led by Enlil. If you translate the Sumerian term Uma Na, you get the following definition: the people of Uma, or the people of the wise woman, because Uma means the wise woman in Sumerian. Here's the idea of wise woman again, of the woman who passed down the secret. Thanks to this definition, we understand that Uma was under the guardianship of some goddesses that were associated with Enki and with the knowledge of the gods, because in French, a wise woman, literally sage femme, is a midwife. And for Sumerians, it is the woman in charge of the genetics, the one in charge of the artificial matrices. The play on words is between sage femme, midwife, and femme sage, wise woman. Therefore, it is the realm led by the mother goddess and Enki. Between the two realms is a stretch of land, a palm grove. It is a sort of small garden called the Gu Adina. This can be translated as the frontier of the plain. In this historical battle between the two realms, we find many elements that can be linked to the Sumerian Eden. Through this story, we understand that the dispute between Enki and Enlil never really had an end. Even if you study the text very thoroughly, it is impossible to know what put an end to these conflicts between Uma and Serbula. The one thing we know is that one city of Uma was wiped out quickly. Kings always mentioned the divine protection given by Enlil and his son in royal text, always reducing the inhabitants of Uma to simple workers that were only good to serve the realm of Lagash and to submit to the patriarchal gods.
Could there be more evidence of this throughout history?
About 5,000 years ago, when you get the emergence of, at least in our timeline, of the first great cities. And that seems to be when this testosterone-driven male aggression and anger start to take everything over, and the goddesses phase. And we still have goddesses, but they're not running the world anymore the way they appear to have done in much more ancient times. There's a clear change of emphasis, and we start having male gods, and they're often very angry and aggressive and domineering male gods, and they want to go take other people's stuff. It's as though some sort of mental virus has entered the world, and we've become these creatures fizzing with testosterone, making war upon one another. You'd be hard put to find evidence of warfare in the Upper Paleolithic when the goddess ruled the world. There was no warfare. These people, they were hunting animals, but they weren't killing each other, not in large numbers at any rate. They may have had the odd fight, but they weren't making war upon one another. But you come down into the Neolithic, as we begin to see the goddess cult trailing off and male gods taking their place, and warfare becomes a very key element of human behavior. And so I think that an old ethic and an old way of doing things, which was harmonious and beautiful and was sustained for tens of thousands of years, was overthrown by the upsurge of the male ego. And I would tie that very much at its worst to the time of the emergence of the first cities, from in our historical timeline, ancient Sumer, for example.
As patriarchy took over matriarchy, women lost their place in society. Their role as goddesses and spiritual leaders was undermined by a new perspective. Women were indoctrined as untrustworthy seductresses. Sean Stone describes how this point of view marked an era of separation between men and women.
In the old tradition, it was really a joint male-female partnership. Over the course of Sumerian time, we recognize that Enki seems to have been considered more of that trickster character, more of the devil in the garden, who essentially gives humans knowledge when Enki gives humans the right to procreate with each other without the permission of the gods. That's when Enlil and the other gods feel that their reign is being threatened by the humans. So Enki seems to have become the devil. He's cast in the devil role, and perhaps women as well as a result, because that whole concept of man and woman, Anki and Ninma, working together to fashion humankind is lost. So by the time you come to the Jewish tradition, for example, you've lost any notion of a female role in the spirituality of the religion. The god Jehovah is a male god. You see no female rabbis in any Jewish tradition until about the 16th, 17th centuries. Same obviously within the Catholic Church, the notion that there really can be no female pope, female cardinals or bishops. It's a very masculine control of the religious inclination. Another important example of the complete takeover of society by patriarchs has occurred by the time of the Greek civilization. Basically by 500 BC and thereafter, all the way through Rome, women are second-class citizens. They have no right to vote. They have no real voice in anything beyond the household. They are essentially outside of the society. You can see basically step by step this descent away from a notion of a man and woman working in conjunction to fashion humanity, to essentially guide humanity. It becomes more and more the assertion of the male energy, the male totem, basically. And that ultimately, I would say, manifests itself in the overall nature of our society. If you look at what Tesla was looking, for example, at the nature of energy creation and production, he was pointing out that what we have is explosive energy, which is male, it's basically male exertion, whereas the female energy is considered more vortical. So only a few of the scientists that were looking into alternative forms of energy that basically was more vortical, what people describe about UFO craft, for example, and the way that their propulsion systems work, that is essentially a female style of energy where it ideally recycles itself.
When you look at the origins of warfare, and this is organized warfare, you don't actually find any good evidence for it until somewhere roughly between about 9,000 and 6,000 BC. That's when real organized warfare seemed to start. And of course, that was after the Neolithic Revolution. Prior to that, yeah, you do find occasional skeletons showing signs of violence, just individual human against human violence. I mean, there's always been that. But this whole thing about humans actually organizing into armies and getting together in groups, and then let's go charge against the other group, and then the other group having to then respond in the same way by forming their own little army, that didn't actually happen until after the Neolithic, by most accounts.
But we talked about the Gnostic tradition and this issue of precisely who created the reality. Was it the male god, the male demiurge, who fashioned the world, or was it the Sophia spirit, divine spirit, wisdom, who came into the reality? And I think that the darker interpretations have oftentimes given onus and power to the male form, whereas the older traditions might actually recognize and respect the fact that it was male and female working in conjunction, in unison, to really create the human existence. Take, for example, the Anunnaki stories about Anki. Anki was this chief scientist who was trying to design the human race on behalf of the sky gods, but in order to do so, he needed Ninma, who was basically his partner and consort.
Looking back to Sumerian times, civilizations of war seem to be preceded and followed by civilizations of peace. Perhaps it's possible that humanity will embrace again a future cycle of matriarchy, a society where we become more cooperative and less aggressive?
I like to look at statistics and evidence. And Steven Pinker wrote a very interesting book called The Better Angels of Our Nature. And he did a long-term study showing that contrary to the images we're getting on TV of the warfare, and of course the images we're getting are very real. We need to solve that. They're very important. They're issues that we need to deal with. But overall, statistically, warfare has been declining over a fairly long period. So we're seeing this general progression of a generally less violent, less warlike global society But corresponding with that is we've seen the role of women increase during the same period of time. I believe that there's a relationship between that. I think the more that women have a role in governance and equality, we're going to see more of that trend happen. Because back in the days, going back much earlier, when we didn't really have organized human warfare, they were much more matriarchal. So shifting the power balance to patriarchy, there are probably all kinds of biological reasons for that. They were the ones who had to go out and hunt the mastodon while the woman is giving life. And so that shift between what we have in our DNA as men and as women, because of that old role, probably then affects the level of violence in our society.
The disappearing wise woman to me refers to our loss of intuition, our heart intelligence, which should be our guiding light. To be whole, we need both intuition and logic, which is kind of the feminine and the masculine principles. You need some structure to your intuition, or else you could get delusional without some structure. We've been cut off from the heart intelligence, and all we have is this logical, rational, egoic mind, and that's when we start really going down the path of error. Yet I do believe there's signs now that we're starting to hopefully correct the situation as more and more people are, returning to that kind of inner voice, that voice, the light of conscience, really. It's the light of conscience. I think we'll get back to a state of wholeness.
If wholeness is the meaning of joint feminine and masculine energies in the world ruling by partnership, then what is our next step? Could ancient history lead us down a new path of thinking? If we, as the current civilization, are indeed returning to our inner voice, then could this inner voice be leading us to a much older civilization that has now just emerged from the ice?
You get reports occasionally of structures emerging out of the ice at Antarctica. Just recently there was one which took my attention, to do with what was described as almost like an embanked area, like a hill fault that was found. And that struck my attention as being different to all the other stories.
Anybody who's a pure-blooded Indian or Native person in the Americas, their whole haplogroup or genetics are A, B, C, or D. But we've tested 3 of these so far, and they are not A, B, C, or D. They show ancestry either from Europe or the Middle East, or the Middle East people who moved to Europe. So that completely blows the theory that there was only one way to get to the Americas in pre-Columbian times.
Could new evidence of a civilization much older than that discovered at Göbekli Tepe be emerging from a desolate continent? Up next, the code unravels, or should we say, melts, from Antarctica to reveal a possible new species on this planet.